Hi BookTube, it's Amy. This evening I read a book that came in the mail for me today, Book Collecting, A Guide for Amateurs by J.H.Slater. So this is an 1892 publication, and J.H.Slater was an author who wrote several books about books. He had a book that seems to have been more popular than this one called The Romance of Book Collecting. But this one in particular was designed for amateur book collectors, for beginners. And even though it's 128 years later, it's still an immensely interesting and in some ways instructive book to read. So my particular edition is, I guess, a limited run. So this is number 344 of a limited large paper edition of 500 copies. Now there seems to have been several printings of this book in 1892. I've seen this version as well as a similar edition with a slightly different shape. I believe, or it could just be, the way the photograph was taken, making it look as though it's a different size. But in my poking around on books, I also saw a brown edition, a brown cover. So I'm quite happy to have this blue and gold one in my collection. But as I said, 128 years later, and there's still a lot of interesting and relevant things to read about. So he tries to make this sort of an all-around guide for the amateur book collector. He begins with a little bit of history about books, famous collectors, so the library in Alexandria, how the printed book as we know it today emerged up until Gutenberg, and how bookbinding sort of emerged in Europe in Venice and spread across Europe. At least that's the way he sees it here. And so he talks about notable presses as well, what he sees as, practical information for the collector who might possibly want to be collecting some books from these presses, or at the very least understand and know about the most popular presses that are collected. And so there is a chapter on the Eldine press in here. Eldine, I've got to remember what his full name was here, but he is the one who created italic font as we know it today. Eldus Manitus of the Eldine press. He created the italic font as we know it today. He showed up, I guess, in Venice, and there were hundreds and hundreds of printers pushing out all this material, all these Greek classics, all these Latin classics and whatnot. And he thought a lot of the printing being done was shoddy and not very refined and not up to his ideas of the kind of craft that should be put into printing. And so he started out by putting lots of effort and creating these beautiful books, which of course went for a higher price given all the labor and materials that were put into them. And those didn't sell well. And so he set out to make a smaller version of his books, a smaller version of his craft, that were still high quality books, but of course used less material. And so he created this italic type to fit more words onto the page. And Slater sort of credits him with the first affordable classic. And so his press emerged from that, and Eldine Press is one of the most collected, well-known presses that came out of that era of Venice. And at least it was 130 years ago when he was publishing, and I believe I've still heard about it today, so I'm sure it's still a highly valued press. Then he goes on to talk about the Elsevier press, which seemed to me more of a collection of presses connected by a family rather than a single press. And he actually includes a family tree in here. Let me see if I can pull it up. A family tree to show how all the different printers and booksellers in this family connected, and at different eras within the family they were using different printers marks, different printers devices. And this is really a beautiful book because he reproduces the different printers devices from all the eras. So we have here, I'll show you the first Aldine press anchor. The first Aldine press anchor up here that was used, and over the years they redesigned the anchor. So it goes from this very simple to this very elaborate printer's device that would have appeared in all the books that were published by Aldine Press, letting people know that these were their books. They had been printed by them. And by 1575, the Aldine device had evolved into that. You can barely see the anchor still in there. So they had some very interesting printers devices, but the Elsevier Press had some interesting ones as well. They used this elaborate tree printer's device. And what's interesting is the Elsevier Press actually bought stock from a previous printer, and so their early books had this sort of globe in them because that had belonged to the previous printer. It says this is the mark of Erfenius, whose stock was purchased by the Elseviers. And so we've got these two notable Venice presses, but then there is an entire chapter in here on early English presses, which I think is especially interesting, and perhaps what made me give this book 5 stars on Goodreads and why I think it's so interesting today. And so there are small descriptions of notable presses and notable printers. So we have William Caxton in 1474, and there's his printer's device. And so the idea is that the collector would use this book almost as a reference. And if they happen to come across something published by one of these early English presses, they would be able to open this up and discover whether it's authentic, and if it's authentic, which era it's from, hopefully by the printer's device reproduced here. And these were fascinating to read through. There are certain presses that Slater knows a lot about, and there are some that really not much is known about them at all. So for instance, we have William Fox here, 1499, and there's his printer's device. And Slater says, this printer is known in connection with a few books, about half a dozen in number, which, as usual, are excessively scarce and very valuable. The dates of his birth and death are uncertain. The first of his books, however, is dated 1499, and the last 1508. And there's some really, what I can only describe, at least from my perspective, bizarre printers' devices. So we have Robert Copland and John Rastall here. And John Rastall is, if you look closely, it's interesting to say the least. And some of these printers' devices incorporate coats of arms, which I would guess in some instances are the coats of arms of the families who are owning these presses. So for instance, John Rastall, according to Bale, this printer was a citizen of London and married the sister of Sir Thomas More. The date of his birth is not known, but he died in 1536, leaving 2 sons, one of whom William succeeded to his business. Ames mentioned 31 works printed by John Rastall and 15 by William, and among the former is the famous Pastime of People or Chronicles of England, of which only 3 perfect copies are known to exist. A facsimile reprint was issued in 1811 by Dr. Dibbin. An original copy of his work, which contains 18 woodcut full-length portraits of the kings, was, though imperfect, sold at Wimpole sale in June 1888 for as much as £79. A copy of the reprint is worth 30 sous. And then we've got this interesting Robert Redman and John Scott. And it just goes on and on for several pages here. Then we have this interesting one that I shared on Instagram a few moments ago. Reynold Wolfe, 1542, and this was the king's printer, in all probability a foreigner by extraction if not by birth. He commenced printing in 1542, but a great portion of his time was spent in collecting materials for a universal cosmology of all nature, which, though undigested at his death in 1573, laid the foundation for the Halsnid Chronicles. And there is this interesting snake on a post, but there are two hands shaking here. And so there's just this interesting section here with these elaborate printers' devices and this information about all these early English printers. But there's also other useful things in here. So a lot of early books printed in Latin often had Latinized place names. And so just by looking at them, you wouldn't know from the place name where they were printed in terms of the modern names we have. And so he includes what I would call a glossary here of Latinized place names. He's offering us actually 1,475 place names, I believe. Or no, it's not that many. But there's several hundred place names here. And I think perhaps these numbers here are in relation to the dates of publication. But Latinized place names, very useful if you are collecting those sorts of books. Certainly not my area of collecting. And I think the only part where I start to disagree with him here is in the final portion of the book when he talks about which books to collect. And he suggests that amateur collectors should be collecting books that are going to increase in value. He's very much of the mindset that book collecting is for people who are collecting physical objects. They may not even read them, and there's no point in buying something that is incomplete or damaged or anything that is not going to be increasing in value. And he actually warns against buying from bookstalls, and he specifically says not to buy recipe books, odd historical volumes, theological treatises, or periodicals, although he does make an exception for old books of sermons, especially if they're by notable people. But for the most part, he says what you're going to find in bookstalls is rubbish. And he would rather you go to reputable booksellers and look for the sort of works that he believes collectors should be collecting. And he does provide in the back here several pages worth of what I would guess are the names of several hundred secondhand booksellers that existed in England when this was published in 1892. And they're listed alphabetically. And I would be interested to know, I'm not curious enough to look into it, but I would be interested to know how many of these bookshops still exist, and if so, when they folded. Because he also provides the date that the bookshops were founded. And he also lists them in part by the sort of books they are selling. So remainders, Roman Catholic, science and medicine, sports and rural books. That's kind of an odd designation. Temperance, theater, theology, first editions of modern books, foreign, genealogy and heraldry, law, music. And so there's all sorts of things in here that would have been very useful and practical for a book collector at the time, especially for someone new to book collecting. But there are all sorts of delightful things in here for people like us today who are just interested in reading about books, about book collecting, and about what I would almost call that era between about 1890 and 1930, sort of the golden age for books about book collecting, because there do seem to have been a great many of them published during that time period. And there's also a short passage in here where he provides some attention to care of books. So I'm just looking for my page reference here. He talks about how paper is made, how books are bound, why books are scarce and rare, defective books, what he calls made-up copies, large paper copies, and then the renovation of books and stains and wormholes. And so he offers what he believes is some practical advice. I'm not sure how wise some of these things would have been, or how useful they would be on modern books. I would suspect on the sort of books that we read today, and even on the sort of books that we consider old, doing these things would probably vastly damage the more contemporary style of paper we use, and might have even done damage at the time. But he does offer some advice here. He says, if damp has only just commenced its attack and the part affected should first be touched with a wash of spirits or wine, and when dry with a very weak solution of oxalic acid. If the fox spots, as they are called, do not then disappear, the injury is permanent and no remedy exists as far as we at present know. A really valuable book which stands in need of a thorough cleaning should be placed in the hands of some competent person, as considerable experience is necessary before even a reasonable degree of success can be assured. This is probably the best advice that he gives in this whole chapter. Put it in the hands of someone competent, because I can't imagine what would happen if somebody followed the advice that he follows with here. So he says, if the marks to be obliterated are numerous, the book had better be taken to pieces by removing the cover and separating the leaves, first cutting the binder's thread and taking especial care not to tear anything. Each leaf must then be examined, both on the flat and when held up to the light, for it is essential that the particular description of dirt should be identified as closely as possible. If grease is apparent, it should first of all be removed, as its presence will interfere with some of the subsequent processes. With this object, the leaf must be laid perfectly flat on a sheet of glass, and the grease marks dampened out with a pad of cotton wool moisturized with benzene. I'm not even sure where you would get benzene, but that's what he's recommending, benzene. He says, rubbing is never resorted to. The spots must be merely patted over and over again until they disappear, which they will do after a time. Sometimes the text itself will vanish as well, but whether it will do so or not depends upon the character of the paper and the quality of the printer's ink. If there is any danger, benzene should not be used, as the whole sheet may be cleared of grease marks almost equally well by covering it with a layer of chalk, placing a piece of blotting paper on top of it, and pressing with a hot iron. Each leaf will, if necessary, have to be treated in the same way, and it may occasionally be found necessary to work on both sides of the paper. When this process is complete, the next step is to give each leaf a good general cleaning, and this may be done effectually by placing it in a leaden trough and pouring upon it a shallow surface of water. 2 or 3 days of exposure to the rays of the sun will bleach the paper perfectly white, and all kinds of stains except fixed dyes will come out. The leaf is then dried, not in the sun or it will turn yellow, and is ready for the next process. It may happen that the sun is not available for this, or indeed any other purpose, and when such is the case, the surface dirt may be bleached off with a solution of chloride of lime in the proportion of 1 part to 40 of water. The paper must be soaked in cold water before this mixture is poured onto it, and both sides must be operated on. This solution being essentially weak, if it were otherwise it would eat into the material, it is possible that it may be found unequal to the task of removing some of the more obstinate stains, which must therefore be touched with nitrohydrochloric acid, Finally, the leaf must be well washed in a stream of running water and allowed to dry naturally. Another method of removing surface stains, sometimes used by restorers, is to cover the paper with a thin layer of fine powdered salt. Lemon juice is then squeezed on the surface in sufficient quantities to dissolve the minerals, and the subject finally washed in boiling water. The chief objection to this process is the use of hot water, which may well be imagined is apt to pulp the paper, or in some cases even to efface the printed text. And so these sound absolutely absurd to us today, but I suppose given the way that paper and ink were made in the kind of books that he is talking about here, those sort of things would have worked. But as you can tell by his descriptions, there's still the high chance that those cleaning methods could go disastrously wrong. You could turn your paper to pulp. You could wash all the ink off of your paper. And in addition, using benzene in your home to clean things, not perhaps the smartest thing to do. And so, as he said, if you have a book that needs attention, perhaps leave it to the experts to deal with it. So this was a fun read, something I would highly recommend if you could get your hands on a copy of it. I do believe it is available online as an ebook. It is, of course, in the public domain, being 128 years old, and you may be able to find a copy of this either through Google Books or through Project Gutenberg. If you happen to have come across this book in your past or anything else by J.H. Slater, I would love to hear about it in the comment section below.